students ready for globalization and look at some of the challenges and the rewards. One of the things we first wanted to look at was the whole notion of what it means to be a global citizen. And for our study, we defined a global citizen as someone who identifies with being part of an emerging world community and whose actions contribute to building this community's values and practices. And in order to answer the question, are Caribbean tertiary level institutions ready for globalization, we engage in a qualitative study. And as we looked at the qualitative study, our main contention was that if Caribbean tertiary level institutions are to subscribe to what would be seen as a comprehensive internationalization and global engagement, there are some fundamental issues that must be addressed. Some of these issues are of a philosophical nature and others at a more practical level of discourse. As authors, we see these discussions as critical to assess and suggest that a paradigm shift as it relates to organizational and pedagogical culture is clearly needed if such efforts are to be appropriately embraced and have successful outcomes for all key stakeholders. So who were the participants in our study? Participants were, as you see, folks who would have graduated from some of the tertiary institutions in the Caribbean or were affiliated in some way with these institutions. Participants came from Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica, Guyana, and we didn't have there, but also the Bahamas. And they tended to range in age from the mid-20s through to the mid-60s. Their professional affiliations were as consultants to different tertiary level institutions, school counselors, and educators both on the tertiary and secondary level. Foreign Service, we also interviewed a Foreign Service officer, as well as project directors and other support specialists with the Ministry of Education. Dr. Wright will speak to us a little bit about the methodology employed.
Thank you, Dr. Bolden. So in order to facilitate this aspect of it, procedure that we facilitated was one of a convenience sample, and we used a mixed method approach in that regards as well, and we also used a snowballing sample technique and a grounded theory in which to carry out this research. And the reason why we chose the grounded theory, according to the literature and the source Strauss and Corbin, the grounded theory approach is really understanding the action from the point of view of that human agent. And since this was a mixed the qualitative, we wanted to hear from the respondents as it related to globalization and tertiary education. So the purpose again is to generate a situated theory about that social phenomenon. In this case it was dealing with globalization and focusing on the area of the study in terms of gathering the data from the various sources, and as you saw, we looked at individuals from across the region. And our approach to this was interviews in terms of focus groups and individual interviews, in person as well as via technology through Skype. And then coding that analysis. And from those categories, we really developed the theoretical sampling and drawing those relationships. And now we're here to communicate those findings in terms, using it in terms of a theory that is inductively derived from the data that we received from the feedback from those educators. I'll now turn this back over to Dr.
Now we wanted to get to some of the meat. And that is, what did the respondents say? And we first wanted to have a look at how the themes that emerged as the respondents defined globalization. And I want you to take a quick glance at the themes that in the respondents' definition of what globalization is. Okay. Now that you've made your quick glance at of the emerging themes, I want you to look at the emerging themes when it came to the respondents' perceptions of the community's definitions. You would note that the themes that emerged in this definition tended to have more of a negative slant, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but you see terms like imposition, threatening, invasion, and then you see at the bottom, apathetic or indifferent, right? So that is important to know because we're going to come back to that in a little while. But before we go on a little further, let's look at some of the benefits of globalization, particularly as it relates to tertiary level institutions. And we have some of those points in red because we will talk a little bit about those particular themes. Not that the others were not important, but we're going to highlight those themes. Dr. Wright.
So again, we see here that issues of neutrality in terms of individuals felt that, the educators felt that this was important, that globalization offered an opportunity for them as educators to interact with their peers and colleagues in a way that would be very informative. In terms of accessibility as well, they felt that, again, this offered the nationals of their respective countries an opportunity to tertiary level education they had never before, and that globalization offered, again, innovation and an opportunity for individuals in terms of nation building if acted upon, and obviously opportunities and knowledge sharing. The other one that was important, as you can see, in terms of cross-fertilization, and a lot of discussion there was, again, sharing of ideas between global partners and as educators in what works best for each country. And the accreditation part, that this is often an opportunity for individuals to think about standards that could be shared in terms of accreditation that would make sense between the different countries in terms of tertiary education and expertise and knowledge creation and rediscovery. In terms of this, again, offered an opportunity for individuals to think about how do we begin to address issues that have long plagued our region in a way that makes sense from our perspective.
Now, we also wanted to look at some of the challenges presented by globalization. And you will see that some things might appear in both cases, but one of the things that some of the respondents shared in a manner that was quite passionate was the whole notion of competition. Now, people get excited about the whole notion about, okay, we are operating in the global world, it gives us exposure to more knowledge, expertise, opportunities, all of those things. But the whole notion of the competition that it brings, competition for programs, competitions for expertise and staff and students, right? And so as more players enter the field, that we run the risk of having some of your brightest and your best being extracted from your pool of potential experts. Now, we are a small island. The Caribbean region is a relatively small region. And the respondents felt that it was important for us to know that with globalization, if we are not careful, that our identity as a Caribbean area could be minimized, and that it was important to help others to realize that they need to be sensitive as it relates to the Caribbean reality. And there was also a need for some quality controls, because they felt that when it came to some small island states, that some people feel, oh, that's just a small island, so we could half step, right? But making sure that even as we open our borders to others, that it was not at the sacrifice of quality. And related to the whole notion about our Caribbean reality was the whole notion of preserving our identity. Now, this morning you would have heard some discussion about the whole notion of STEM. And STEM stands for science, technology, not education, but engineering and math, right? And what we kept hearing is that there is not the kind of value as far as STEM programs are concerned that you see in other places. That funding is not set aside to the degree that it should for those programs in those particular areas. But as you look at how things are operating within the global economy, you realize that the whole STEM approach is one that we cannot afford to devalue. And the one that's obvious that we have been flogging it like a dead horse was the whole notion of the brain drain, right, that could possibly happen as we open our borders. Dr. Wright will talk a little bit about some of the other issues. But what we want to, our conclusion then, is that Caribbean tertiary institutions, for the most part, appears to not be ready to fully integrate an emphasis on globalization, although some significant progress must clearly be noted. So then, there's a need for a paradigm shift. Keeping our heads buried in the sand will not work. So our study also identifies some areas of concerns, and we divided them into these 4 categories. And when we look at the whole issue as far as structural concerns, respondents tended to voice that there were no significant supports, right? In fact, in some cases, there were disincentives for folks to engage in research or innovation. When it came to academics, we also had some concerns. There were a number of course offerings that were highlighted that they said are not currently offered at Caribbean tertiary institutions that needed to be offered if we are supposed to be a significant player in the global economy. This other issue about preparing our students in such a way that they're just regurgitating rather than engaging in that deep learning and issues of critical thinking was one that surfaced time and time again. I know that we are making some movements as far as accreditation is concerned, but that was also highlighted as an area of concern that we must focus on. The compatibility of the standards advanced by that of the region, the Caribbean region, must be in sync or compatible to that by the more larger accredited bodies globally. And they said, okay, with competition, all our doors are opening and all of these people are coming in, and that's all well and good. But there was a concern as far as the risk of unfair wage earnings as the pool of recruits widened. Dr. Wright?
Okay. So I think that Dr. Bolden laid out quite a few things for us to consider as in regards to the respondents' perception of globalization and tertiary Caribbean education. The other thing, again, we highlighted again, that making tertiary education more relevant was that aspect of critical thinking. Time and time, respondents said that, you know what, these online programs and we move to online, how do we evaluate critical thinking? How are we